The story of Sacagawea begins long before her name entered American history books. Born around 1788 among the Lemhi Shoshone people in what is now Idaho, she grew up in a land of high mountain valleys, clear rivers, and buffalo plains that stretched toward the horizon. Her childhood was marked by the rhythms of her people: seasonal hunts, family gatherings, stories passed down around firelight. She was a girl of the Shoshone before she became a legend to the Americans who would one day cross her path. When she was around 12 years old, her life was violently altered. A Hidatsa raiding party swept down upon her village, killing many and capturing others. Sacagawea was among those taken. She was torn from her family and forced eastward to the Hidatsa villages near present-day North Dakota. For 4 years, she lived among her captors, adapting to new languages, new customs, and new expectations. Childhood was replaced by survival. It was in this period that she became the wife, or more accurately, the property, of a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau. He had taken her, along with another Shoshone woman, as a young wife while she was still a teenager. In the winter of 1804 to 1805, her life took another turn. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had built Fort Mandan near the Hidatsa and Mandan villages. They were preparing to continue their journey west, a monumental expedition tasked by President Thomas Jefferson with exploring the newly acquired Louisiana Territory and finding a route to the Pacific. Charbonneau, eager for pay and prestige, presented himself as an interpreter. Lewis and Clark accepted his offer, though reluctantly, for his reputation as a man of little courage and less skill was already known. What convinced them was not Charbonneau, but Sacagawea. She was young, pregnant, and yet more valuable than she likely realized. She spoke Shoshone. She could serve as a bridge when the core of discovery reached the mountains, where her people lived and where horses would be essential for crossing. Her very presence carried meaning. A woman, carrying a child, traveling with a band of armed men. This was not the image of a raiding party. It was the image of peaceful travel, a signal to tribes along the way that the Americans did not come solely for war. In February 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to her first child, a boy named Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Clark, who would later call the boy Pomp, stood as something of a godfather, marveling at the infant's resilience. Less than 2 months later, Sacagawea placed her newborn in a cradleboard and set out with the Corps. She was no longer just a young mother or a captive wife. She had become part of one of the most ambitious journeys in American history. As the Corps moved westward, Sacagawea proved her worth again and again. In the spring of 1805, the expedition nearly lost invaluable records, instruments, and medicines when a pirogue tipped in the Missouri River. Charbonneau panicked, fumbling helplessly. Sacagawea, with her infant strapped to her back, calmly saved documents, supplies, and instruments, securing them before they could be swept away. Lewis and Clark noted her composure and bravery in their journals. In that moment, she was no longer just useful. She was indispensable. Her skills as a forager and interpreter surfaced constantly. She identified edible plants and roots. She explained tribal customs. She interpreted words when Shoshone bands were encountered, helping to open paths of trade and negotiation. Perhaps the most dramatic example came when the expedition reached the Lemhi Shoshone in August 1805. The Corps needed horses to cross the Bitterroot Mountains. Without them, the expedition would likely have failed. When Sacagawea recognized the Shoshone chief as her own brother, Kameawait, fate seemed to intervene. The reunion was emotional: tears, embraces, disbelief. Through her, negotiations were not just business, but family. Horses were secured, and the Corps pressed onward. Sacagawea's role was never simple. She was interpreter, symbol, rescuer, and mother all at once. She nursed her infant while trudging mile after mile. She carried loads when necessary. She healed disputes with her presence and prevented misunderstandings by her very existence. In the freezing Bitterroots, when men doubted survival, she carried her child on her back through snowdrifts, embodying endurance itself. At times, Lewis and Clark recorded her opinions, a rarity for women in their journals. She advised on routes, pointed out landmarks, and suggested edible routes. Though her status was far from equal, her voice carried weight in decisions that shaped the journey. By November 1805, the Corps reached the Pacific. Sacagawea stood on the shoreline, waves crashing, her baby still at her side. For the Americans, it was the fulfillment of Jefferson's grand vision. For Sacagawea, it was another chapter in a life already marked by upheaval. She had traveled more than 4,000 miles. She had crossed plains, rivers, and mountains. She had done so not as a soldier, but as a teenage mother, yet her resilience carried men who might otherwise have faltered. The Corps returned east in 1806. Clark offered to raise Jean-Baptiste as his own, admiring him deeply. Sacagawea and Charbonneau, however, continued to live among the tribes and traders of the upper Missouri. For Sacagawea, the journey was never about fame. She faded from the journals of history even as her name lived on in myth. Her death remains uncertain. Some accounts say she died in 1812 at Fort Manuel, a trading post in present-day South Dakota, possibly of fever. Other oral traditions among the Shoshone hold that she lived into old age, returning to her people and dying near the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming in 1884. Historians debate, but among her people, the belief in her long life is part of her legend. What is not debated is her impact. Without her, the Corps of Discovery would have struggled to secure horses, to interpret, to calm wary tribes. Without her, vital supplies might have been lost in the Missouri. Without her, the image of a peaceful mission would have been far less convincing. Sacagawea became a symbol, first for the explorers who owed their success in part to her, later for generations who looked back and saw in her resilience the story of survival, adaptation, and quiet strength. Statues would be raised. Her face would one day appear on U.S. currency. Schools, rivers, and mountains would carry her name. Yet behind the bronze and paper is the truth of a Shoshone girl taken from her family, bound to a trader, thrust into an expedition she never chose, who still became a pillar on which history leaned. The story of Sacagawea is one of contradictions, victory and loss, freedom and captivity, myth and memory. She was never merely a guide. She was a mother walking west with her child, an interpreter building bridges, and a survivor navigating two worlds. The Corps of Discovery reached the Pacific, but Sacagawea's journey was far larger than that single expedition. She carried the past of her people, the burden of her captivity, and the future of her child, all while walking into history with quiet endurance. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.